some of our time short, which I know he's probably not going to do that, with Don Preston. But let me take you back just a little bit. Don and I have known each other almost 40, probably 35, 37 years. When I got dismissed from the East Haven Church here in Memphis, I wrote a paper in defense of my views. And a mutual friend of ours took that paper because I was having discussions with him all along, and he was thoroughly convinced, I believe still to this very day is, but he chose that he was never going to teach it publicly because he didn't want to lose his retirement. Those were his words to me. Don can confirm them as well. And so he took the paper, handed it to Don, because at that time, Don was trying to figure out some things on the resurrection. I didn't have them all filled out, but I might have had a little bit, figured out, but I might have had a little bit more figured out than he did at that time. And so he shared that paper with Don, and then I was living just a couple of streets over at the time, and I got this phone call. He says, well, you don't know me. And he says, but I found your paper to be quite interesting, something to that effect. And since that time, we have been on the phone with each other. You could almost say literally almost every day, or, there isn't a week that passes that we don't communicate. And now that we got all this high-tech technology, we don't necessarily talk every week, but we share information through email. I have known him over the years. We have been in the trenches together, and when he was going through a process that I had already gone through, and I told him what it was going to be like, I told him what was going to happen to him, and it pretty much turned out just the way I said. There were times when he has been discouraged, and I was there as a shoulder for him to lean on. There were times when I was discouraged and just didn't want to go any further, and he kept dragging me along until I could restore and renew my commitment and conviction to teach the truth. And for that, I am truly, truly grateful. I've never seen a man so dedicated, so consistent, and so thoroughly engaged in a love of the truth and a willingness to defend it. He has stood against every name out there that is supposed to be a name in eschatology who was willing to meet him on the platform. Most of the others, once they've heard about him, don't want any part of it. And he still does that to this very day. He rises early in the morning, goes to bed early, but he gets up consistently every morning and goes to his office, and he engages in study, and he does that consistently. He has written more books on eschatology than any man I know. While we're trying to write a chapter, Dunn writes 2 or 3 books. And they're not just, shallow information. You've heard them talk. This is some of the most detailed, some of the most just in-depth information of tearing apart arguments. That's his unique and powerful skill. He has the ability to sniff out an argument and get to the very core of it, and then present it in a way that's very, very clear, powerful, and just absolutely awesome. I know I've said enough. His wife, Jan, they've been dealing with her illness. We've prayed for them often, and we still do. And I just want to say and present to you my great friend, a great minister, and a brother that I love, Dr. Dunn Preston. Oh, you want me to put the lapel on? Yep. All right.
Yeah. Well, all right, here we go. Oh, okay. Well, first of all, let me express my appreciation to William for the kind words. I tell people all the time that I don't have a better friend in this world than William Bell. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. And I have to say that he and I are both absolutely wonderfully, wonderfully blessed to have wives who have stood with us through all of the conflict and been our shoulders and our support and our love. My wife thought about coming, but as William mentioned, my wife, and as many of you know, and thank you so very, very much for all of you who have inquired about my wife. Thankfully, she is doing much better. She's a 2-time cancer survivor, and she right now has been declared cancer-free. Her health is continuing to, amen. Her health continues to improve right along, and for that we are just, extremely, extremely thankful, and we appreciate all of the prayers that have been offered on her behalf. And I just want to say how good it is to be back here at the Rains Road congregation. I was trying to remember, William, how long it's been since I was here, but it was way before the renovations. And Tamara and Tasha were about that big. I mean, literally, they were just really, really young. And I'll just say this before I get started. I was a little bit fearful because the last time I was here actually was at the conference, 3 years ago? Something like that. And I was standing with my back turned, and all of a sudden I was hit in the back. And I turned around, and this young woman was standing there, and she was like, and I couldn't remember which one she was. I knew that it was one of William's daughters. And I was searching for names, and I was trying to remember, and she threatened me with bodily harm if I didn't remember her. If I did not remember her this time. So when I was picked up at the airport yesterday by Demetrius, okay, we're coming here, and I said, okay, Demetrius, you really, really got to help me out. I said, one of the two of them threatened me with bodily harm if I didn't remember which one was which this time. So you got to tell me which one is which. I mean, I remembered the names, okay? I knew Tamara and I knew Tasha, but I couldn't put the faces with them. And he thought just a minute, he goes, well, Tamara's the short one. I go, okay, cool. So I'm expecting this much of a disparity, right? So I managed to get here early. We were here earlier today. Well, Tamara is there, and we get to talking, and so I go, okay, I know who Tamara is. Now I know who the other one is. Trouble of it is, when I'm standing there, and I turn around, and here is Tasha, and she's like, okay, come on. And thanks to the fact that I had already pegged Tamara, and I knew who Tamara was through a process of elimination, I pretty well had this figured out who Tasha was. And so she thought she had me, though. And she goes, no, you don't know. And I said, I do, Tasha. So I got her. But it's great. I tell you, it is great to be back with you. So many of you I know by name, but not by face. And so it's good to put faces with you. Well, when William called and asked and invited me to speak here at the conference, I was thrilled as usual just for an opportunity to come back and to visit with so many of you again and to see new faces and what have you. And so I asked him, what do you want me to talk on? And he said, well, we're going to do the Okay, I'll just put it in my pocket. And I said, I want Colossians. Now, I've written 2 books 3 books on Thessalonians. And he was a little surprised that I didn't want Thessalonians. But I've been doing some study on the book of Colossians, and one of my, I suppose you'd call it one of my passions these days, is studying the subject of the passing of the old law. And I have become more acutely aware down through the years of how vital, how crucial, how foundational the issue of the passing of the law of Moses is. In my ignorance years ago, I made the comment that I could prove the Lord came in AD 70 without discussing the passing of the law of Moses. Well, I suppose that's technically correct. You can focus on the time statements and know that the Lord and His apostles and disciples certainly believed that the parousia was to be in the first century. No doubt about that. But when you add to that reality the idea and the fact of the end of the age being the end of the Old Covenant age, then you have a double-barrel shotgun that's loaded with buckshot, so to speak. And so I have become focused over the last few years. I've currently written 3, maybe 4, I don't know, books on Torah to tell us. And that means that Torah, the law of Moses, would endure until the consummation, until the day of the Lord. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you, or I, like most of you, were raised believing that Colossians Chapter 2, verses 14 to 17 was basically the definitive text when it comes to discussing the end of the law of Moses. And that text says, "And you," as Paul wrote to the Colossians, "you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, He is made alive with Him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and He took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Having disarmed principalities and powers, He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. So, let no one judge you in respect of food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ." So as I said, I suspect that I'm like most of you. I know that being raised in the churches of Christ, a 5th generation member of the churches of Christ, I was raised believing and assuming that Colossians chapter 2 was absolute, rock solid. It was, an unget-overable argument to prove that the law of Moses passed away at the cross. It was nailed to the cross. I believe this passage, at the time I believed, it was clear, unambiguous, undeniable. However, down through the years, I began to encounter some difficulties with that, especially as I began to examine the Greek of the text of Colossians chapter 2. I soon discovered that there were some really, really serious problems with saying, or with claiming, that Paul was saying that it was the law itself that was nailed to the cross. I was shocked, as a matter of fact, to learn that is not what the Greek text says. Then, some years ago, I began to study the issue of the Jewish feast days. And I blame everything, basically, on David Curtis. But even before that, Bill Cannengeiser, who unfortunately passed away recently, Bill Cannengeiser was a true scholar when it came to the Jewish feast days. I mean, he had insights that would just literally blow my mind. And Bill at one time was calling me about one time a week and sharing thoughts with me, challenging me to think, to study, to consider, and what have you. But I've told this story before that years ago, I don't know how long ago, it's probably been 15 years ago now, I was at a conference and David Curtis was speaking. And he spoke on the feast days. And even though I'd been talking to Bill Cannengeiser for a good long time, and even though Bill had challenged me and opened up my mind to that thought, what David presented that day was so incredibly powerful, communicated so wonderfully, so beautifully, and with such clarity. I turned to my wife at the end of the lesson and I said, "Why is it that I've lived this long and been so ignorant? Why did I not know this stuff?" And the reason I didn't is because in the churches of Christ, we never studied the Jewish festivals. Period. End of story. Now, with that said, it might have been taken notice. Oh, like Jesus is our Passover. The day of Pentecost, Feast of the First Fruits, fulfilled in Jesus. But if you to this very day were to ask your standard normal Church of Christ minister, and I'll guarantee you, if you were to go to the Memphis School of Preaching and to ask the leaders of that school or any of the students of that school, are the Jewish feast days fulfilled today, right now? Are they completely fulfilled? They would say, of course, they're all nailed to the cross. Well, then what did Rosh Hashanah represent? And they would go, Rosh who? Is that Rush Limbaugh's brother? Yom Kippur. Oh, well, no, we've heard of that. Day of Atonement, absolutely fulfilled. What about Sukkot? Anything like a mink coat? No. Because there is such an underwriting foundational ignorance. And I say that as kindly as possible. I use it in the same sense of my own ignorance for years and years and years. Because I simply had not studied the subject. For the last several years, and basically ever since David Curtis, I have been immersing myself in a study of the Jewish feast days. I am thoroughly convinced that a proper understanding of the Jewish feast days gives us a proper understanding of the time, the framework, and the context of the passing of the law of Moses, and it was not at the cross. Was the cross the power by which that would be accomplished? Unequivocally, yes. The death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus is the foundation of our entire faith. Nobody is denying that. But I think it's Steve who talked about the transitional period of time, that period of already but not yet, and that's what we want to talk about. So this lesson is going to focus on Israel's festal calendar as referenced by Paul. Paul said, because of what Christ did at the cross, let no man judge you in respect of food or drink, new moons, feast days, or Sabbaths. The normal explanation of that is, don't let anyone judge you in respect of those things because Jesus nailed those things to the law or to the cross. Pardon me. But what did Paul really mean? This is what I was completely surprised at when I began to look at the Greek of the text. It's normally assumed that when Paul said the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, he meant the law of Moses itself. You'll find that in many, many commentaries. However, this is a misunderstanding of the Greek text. That word handwriting of ordinances is from a Greek word, cheirographon. And it is taken from the world of commerce. And we might say that a handwriting of debt. And to cite just two examples of the Greek scholars that could be quoted, James D.G. Dunn, who is recognized as a world-class Greek scholar, said, quote, the expunging of the record confirms that none of the transgressions is any longer held against us. In other words, Paul's saying there was a bill of debt. We owed a debt. And Jesus took the debt away. Okay? This does not mean, however, that the underlying decrees or regulations cease to be of force. That is, the law no longer functions as God's yardstick of right and judgment. There is no contradiction here with Romans 2, 12 to 16. It is simply saying that the record of transgressions has been erased. It's another way of saying sin has been forgiven. Do you catch the power of that? Not the law that was nailed to the cross, the debt incurred through violating the law was nailed to the cross. David Patterson, another well-recognized Greek scholar, says, quote, the word, not world, the word exelphine, blot out, is the same as in Colossians Chapter 2 and verse 14, where it means, quote, canceling the bond that the law creates. He was commenting on another text, by the way, in the book of Acts. But he says, thus, it was not the law itself that was removed or nailed to the cross. It was the bond created by the law. Now, what does that mean? Well, Paul said, I was alive once without the law. The commandment came, sin revived, and I died. Paul paid the penalty for sin, the sin that was incurred through violation of the law. So what did he need? Paul needed to be forgiven of the sin brought in through the law. Now, there is an incredible conundrum an apparent contradiction, if you please, in Colossians Chapter 2. The traditional view of Colossians Chapter 2 creates what I consider to be an incredible problem, and it claims that Paul said that the law was nailed to the cross. However, if the law, and right here is a big crux of where what I'm going to develop in this first lesson. And I got to tell you, I just appreciate William saying I've got 6 lesson spots. Okay, right, William? Right? No, okay. If the law itself had been nailed to the cross, then how could Paul say that the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, all of which were fundamentally the law, right? We'll see that more in a moment, were still shadows of the good things about to come. In other words, how can it be said that the law was nailed to the cross if the law was still a shadow of things that had not yet come? Now, let me point something out. When Paul says they are, that is the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, and he says they are, that's in the present active indicative in the Greek. It doesn't say they were. It says they are. And he says they are shadows. They were still, when Paul wrote, shadows of the good things about to come, from the Greek word mellow. Mellow in the infinitive, which the Blas de Brunner Greek grammar of the New Testament says that mellow in the infinitive indicates imminence. Something about to happen. So here is Paul in a passage that supposedly teaches that the law was nailed to the cross, abrogated and annulled, and yet here's Paul writing in the 60s, over 30 years after the cross, saying that the law was still a shadow of good things that had not yet come. Folks, that's a problem. So, the commentators really struggle with this. They honestly do. Scott McKnight, who is an author that I absolutely love. I really enjoy Scott McKnight's writing. If you haven't read his book, A New Vision for Israel, I recommend that you get it. I won't take a lot of time to tell you about it except to point out that in it he says, in his eschatology, Jesus saw no further than the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And in that regard, he was absolutely correct. And yet he's not a full preterist. Okay, moving on. So Scott McKnight says, skia melon tone, with the genitive being objective, that is, they foreshadowed him who is to come. The present tense of the participle here is reconceptualized in many grammar discussions to a past tense, because after all, that is the reality. Boy, those are some really fancy words. Do you know what Scott McKnight is saying there? Scott McKnight is saying, well, you know, even though the language, even though the linguistics, even though the grammar of the text is present active, because the commentators believe that the law had passed, they changed the present tenses into past tenses. You know what that means? They're putting their preconceived theology over grammar and over linguistics. Sorry, I don't accept that approach. Just don't like that. I mean, you can literally make the Bible mean anything you want to if you take that approach. Now, what happens here is that Scott McKnight, along with most commentators, ignores Paul's focus on the feast days. And they say, well, the body, which Paul says, those are all shadows of the good things to come, but Christ is the body. Greek word soma, by the way. Soma. Okay. So they say, well, Christ has come, therefore those things are fulfilled. Well, there's no question that Christ is the fulfillment of those things, but He is the one that would bring those things to fulfillment at the proper time. And that's what is missing in these discussions. By the way, what time am I supposed to shut up? Supposed to shut up. Supposed to shut up.
But I've got 26 minutes on my clock. I don't know how many Chad has on his.
I don't know when you started exactly.
Good.
I know it's about 10, 12 after that you got back. Yeah. So probably quarter after you give me...
Okay. Thank you. Well, somebody give me William, you'll have to give me a high sign. Okay. So let me reiterate that Paul is very, very clear that these new moons, feast days, and the Sabbaths were present tense shadows of the good things that were still, when he wrote, about to come. Now what I want to do here is try to find some common ground between Jesus and Paul. All right? What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18? Do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. I'm going to say something about ellipsis here momentarily. I hope you know what ellipsis means because it is crucial in this text. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. I believe Jesus' words are clear, they're unambiguous, they are undeniable. Now, when Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it was all fulfilled, we then have Paul ostensibly saying that a huge bunch of the jots and the tittles of the law, the feast days, had supposedly already been done away with. Oh, but wait, no, he doesn't, does he? They were still, when he wrote, shadows of the good things to come. Once again, the conundrum. How can you argue that the law had been taken away when Jesus said not one jot or one tittle of the law will pass away until it is all fulfilled? And then you've got Paul saying, guess what? A whole bunch of the jots and a whole bunch of the tittles of the law haven't been fulfilled yet. So if a whole bunch of the jots and the tittles had not been fulfilled, what does that mean? The law had not passed. Now let's look just a little bit closer. What was the law that had to be fulfilled? Over the years, William and I and all of these other brethren, we've just encountered all sorts of attempts to escape Paul's words. Well, you know, when Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled, what Jesus really meant by the law was all direct commandments, not prophecy. No. Prophecy is not included there. When I debated Mac Deaver, he tried to make that argument. All that Jesus meant was all direct commandments of the law had to be fulfilled. All prophecy did not. Well, more on that momentarily. Just recently, I've been reading the argument that what Jesus meant was, in spite of the words, what Jesus really meant was only the righteous requirements of the law had to be fulfilled for the law to pass. And then we're told, well, what Jesus really meant was only the Decalogue, that is the 10 Commandments, only the 10 Commandments had to be fulfilled as opposed to the so-called ceremonial, sacrificial law. Now, when I was a young guy, junior, senior in high school, I was being trained as a salesman, and I used to go to Pea Ridge, Arkansas, and there was a Sabbatarian community there. And they had a vegetarian store run by one of the elders who was a patriarch of that Seventh-day Adventist community. And he and I used to tie it up twice a week. I mean, tie it up. He always thought that since I was a young whippersnapper, he would just tie me up in knots. And I just absolutely loved to go round and round with him. And my discussions with him were helpful in training me. Trouble of it was, he was wrong and I was wrong. And we would go head to head, not realizing that both of us were on different pages, not understanding what Jesus was saying. Now, I suggest to you that all of these attempts to qualify or limit Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 are misguided. Point number one, there is no qualifier in the text that tells us just the moral commands. There is no qualifier that says the law versus the prophets. As a matter of fact, I mentioned ellipsis a moment ago. What is ellipsis? Well, ellipsis is a kind of a statement in which you say one thing, you define it, and then you restate it partially, but in the partial statement, the entire thing is included. Now, here's what I mean. And that's not the greatest, most succinct explanation, but hopefully you'll see what I mean. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy what? The law or the prophets. I came to fulfill. Fulfill what? Oh, the law, but no prophets. No, that is a violation of ellipsis. Ellipsis is an inclusive literary and grammatical concept. And it is, but this gets back to people's attempts to escape the force of the text. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. Well, if you're going to say the prophets are not included, then Jesus was saying, I didn't come to fulfill any prophecies. How would that work? It wouldn't at all. And that's all I'll say about that. But let me simply point this out. The Jews had absolutely no concept of a division of the law into moral versus ceremonial. Now, did they know that a law of sacrifice was technically different than thou shalt not kill? Well, of course. But insofar as the value of the law, insofar as the binding nature of the law, insofar as the source of the law, they knew no distinction. And that is extremely important. So let's take a look then at what Jesus is saying. How He's defining the law and the prophets in Matthew chapter 5, and take a look at Colossians chapter 2. Since Jesus said that every jot and every tittle of the law and the prophecy had to be fulfilled before the law could pass, how does this apply to Colossians chapter 2? Quite specifically. Remember, Paul mentioned the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. Were those practices of the feast days, were they part of the law? Well, guess what? All of the feast days of Israel, 7 of them, are to be found in Leviticus chapter 23. You can also go to Exodus 23, Numbers chapter 28, Numbers chapter 29, but Leviticus chapter 23 is really the foundational text. Would anybody deny that Leviticus is the law? I don't know of anybody that's ever argued that. Were the feast days prophetic? Oh yeah. What did Paul say? They're shadows of the good things about to come. Hebrews chapter 10, in describing the Day of Atonement practice of the high priest, killing the sacrifice, going into the most holy place, coming back out. The writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 10 that Christ had to come and appear the second time for salvation the chapter division between chapter 9, 28 and chapter 10, verse 1 is horrid. I mean, it's awful. The word for, Greek word gar, is a connecting particle that tells you why Christ had to come the second time. For the law having or being a shadow of the good things about to come. Amen. That's why Christ had to come again, to fulfill the law, because the law contained the types and the shadows. So once again, was Leviticus chapter 23 the law? Of course it was. Were the feast days commandments of the Lord? Well, if you didn't observe them, you could die. So I would consider that a pretty important commandment. By the way, every one of the feast days was a Sabbath. Then you have the Sabbath of Exodus chapter 20. Would anyone deny that that was the law? I don't know of anybody that would deny that. So, Leviticus was clearly the law, part of the Pentateuch. The feast days were commandments of the law. All of the feast days were Sabbaths. And the Sabbath was fundamentally the law. So Paul said that the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were, when he wrote, shadows of the good things to come. Those festivals were prophetic. Thus, when Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets, this means that the prophetic element of the feast days had to be fulfilled for the law to pass. Jesus was not, you can't find a shred, a syllable of evidence or proof to show that Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 was delineating between any aspect of the Torah. the Old Law, or what is more broadly known as the Tanakh, the entire Old Testament. And so once again, when Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the law of the prophets, but to fulfill the law of the prophets, this means that the prophetic element of the feast days, which were the law, had to be fulfilled in order for the law to pass. The new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were, in fact, the law, and they were the prophets. And by the way, this has always struck me as rather strange. The feast days were a humongous part of the jots and the tittles. The feast days, it can be justifiably said without too much of an exaggeration. The temple, the priesthood, the altar stood to service the feast days. Without the feast days, that's almost an empty edifice. Because every Sabbath day you had the offerings and the sacrifices. Every new moon you had sacrifices. Every spring you have 4 feast days. Every fall you have 3 feast days. The entire year, in other words, was consumed with the observance of feast days. To suggest, therefore, that the fulfillment of Israel's feast days is really unimportant displays a really, really unfortunate misunderstanding of God's scheme of redemption. I shared some of my convictions with a good friend of mine, Doug Wilkinson, on one occasion, what I was beginning to see about the relationship between eschatology and the feast days. And Doug wrote back and he said, you know, Don, he said, as a result of what you've been sharing with me, he said, I've come to see Israel's feast days as the Rosetta Stone of eschatology. Think about that term. And I told him, I said, well, just consider this. I've just stolen that term. I'm going to use it because I am convinced it's absolutely correct. Without an understanding of the Jewish feast days, we will not understand biblical eschatology. But the traditional view of the law has the law passing away. Without a huge element, a huge foundational and structural amount of the jots and the tittles being fulfilled, and that is a direct violation of what Jesus said. So, for your consideration, not one jot, not one tittle of the law would pass until it was all fulfilled. The new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths constituted a major portion of the jots and the tittles of the law. The new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths of the law were not fulfilled when Paul wrote Colossians. Therefore, not one jot or one tittle of the law had passed when Paul wrote. Now then, that was all introductory, okay? I really, really hope I can get to this. How much?
12 minutes.
Okay. Paul's reference to the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths is a direct reference to Israel's festal calendar, which mandated 7 feast days. Passover, which started Israel's civil year. It began, it was 14-day celebration. Excuse me, it was on the 14th day. Feast of Unleavened Bread, the day after the Passover, Leviticus Chapter 23. I'm really skipping over a lot of time here. But notice the Feast of Weeks. They were to count 7 Sabbaths after the Passover. And on the day after the 7th Sabbath was to be the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost, Feast of First Fruit. Following Pentecost was a period of 4 months, a period 4 times 30 or 3 times 40, if you wish to express it like that. You know what the Jewish rabbis called that 4-month period of time? The time of waiting for the judgment. Do you know why they called it that? They called it that because the next feast day on the calendar was known as Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. 4 months after Pentecost. It is incredibly significant that in Acts chapter 3, after Pentecost has just finished, Peter, preaching to the Jews in the temple, said, "Repent therefore and be converted," which, by the way, is taken directly from Malachi, but I don't have time to get into that, "that your sins may be blotted out, and that he may send times of refreshment from the presence of the Lord. Now, the word that is translated, times of refreshments, I really have a tough time saying it, so I won't even try. But it means respite from judgment. It's the period of a break before judgment comes. Why in the world would Peter, Pentecost just over, now they're waiting for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the Feast of Trumpets, which represents the judgment. Why would Peter say, repent, that the Lord may give you respite from judgment? Because the period that they were now in was the time of waiting for the judgment. That's why. The fall feasts were Rosh Hashanah, as just mentioned, otherwise known as Teruah, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Resurrection. This was held in the 7th month and the 5th day, or 15th day. I'm going to do the best that I can here. What I want to be able to do in the next few moments is to show that the spring festivals were, once again, Passover. Jesus, when he hung on the cross, as he hung there said, "It is finished." I have an awful lot of people who say, see, right there, Jesus was saying the law was being nailed to the cross. The law is done. It's over. It's gone. They're failing to understand that Jesus was the Passover being offered at that very moment. And at that very moment, in the temple, the high priest was killing the sacrifice. That's why John is so careful about his time statements in the book of John about the Passover and about what was going on. At the moment Jesus cried out saying, "It is finished," the high priest killed the Passover lamb. Jesus wasn't saying, "Oh, the law is passed. It's done." No, he was saying, this Passover sacrifice is now offered. But that only meant that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and Passover had to be fulfilled next. So Jesus fulfilled the first 4 feast days dramatically. I mean dramatically and right on time, by the way. Now here's a question to ponder. Did Jesus have to fulfill the Passover sacrifice for the law to pass? Well, nobody would deny that. Well, sure, he died on the cross. He nailed the law to the cross. So sure, he had to die as the Passover. Well, if Jesus had to fulfill one of the feast days, he had to fulfill them all. Because they were all jots and tittles of the law. I've got to hurry. So if one had to be fulfilled, they all had to be fulfilled. Now then, let me share with you how prominently the feast days play into Jesus' eschatology. Embedded within Jesus' Temple and Olivet Discourse are important allusions and citations directly tied to the Jewish calendar. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is standing in the temple and he gave 7 woes against Jerusalem and the temple. That final woe was, "Upon you shall come all of the righteous blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all of these things shall come upon this generation." O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks together, but you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. And then, in what seems to be, and is what is taken by many commentators to be a direct about face, Jesus said, "And verily I say unto you, you will not see me henceforth until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And so our dispensational friends say, well, see, Jesus is predicting the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem. Thomas Ice, with whom I've had 4 debates, says, well, yeah, Matthew chapter 23, verse 33 to 37 is clearly AD 70, but in verse 39, that's talking about the conversion of Israel at the second coming. problem. What is being overlooked here, and I don't have time to tell the story, but you know, sometimes you find nuggets in the strangest of places. I was in a used bookstore years ago, picked up a book, flipped a page, and there was a comment on Matthew 23:39. And I read it and I thought, oh, wow, that is so good. Here's the comment. This scholar of note, a 19th century scholar, said, when Jesus said, "You will not see me again henceforth until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," he is citing directly from the Song of Ascent. Now, I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but how many of you know what the Songs of Ascent are? Guess what? I didn't know either. If it makes you feel any better, I was going, what in the world were the Songs of Ascent? Well, they're from the Psalms, Psalms 120 through Psalms 134. Some counts give, different verses, but nonetheless, that's them. Now, what did the Songs of Ascent say? What were they? 3 times a year, according to Leviticus Chapter 23 and Exodus 34, all the men of Israel were to go to Jerusalem to observe those 3 great Jewish festivals. During those times, the citizens of Jerusalem, when the witnesses would spy the caravans of the worshipers who were coming, they would get up on the walls, and the citizens of Jerusalem would get up on the walls, and they would sing this great Hallel. There were 2 great Hallels. I'll talk about the other one tomorrow. But this chief Hallel that was sung as the worshipers came up in their caravans up the rocky, crooked path to Jerusalem, and the hills. It's amazing to think about, to visualize, and to try to grasp what it was like. But here you have hundreds, thousands of men and women up on the walls of Jerusalem. You know what they were singing? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's what they did every single feast day. Well, how does that relate to Matthew 23:39? Jesus had just predicted the fall of Jerusalem for his generation. He is now saying, you will not see me again. Oh, I'm coming, but I'm coming in judgment. Oh, Lord, when are you going to come? When you sing, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's a cryptic way of saying, during your feast days, which are supposed to be times of joy and celebration, I'm going to turn those celebrations into sorrow and tears and desolation. Look next at the passage that I want to get into, which I hope to have more time to comment on tomorrow. Another reference to a feast day. In Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, Jesus, in predicting his coming against Jerusalem in that generation, he said immediately after the tribulation of those days, the events leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars of heaven shall fall from the sky, and they shall see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens. And they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And the Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather together the elect from the 4 winds. Now, that word gather together, that 2-word statement there, is from the Greek word episynagoge. It is an incredibly powerful and important word in the Old Testament. When God predicted the Messianic temple and the conversion of the Gentiles along with Israel restored, he used episynagoge. Now notice what we have here. The festival of ingathering, the Feast of Sukkot, which is going to consume all of our time tomorrow from the book of John. And let me ask you to read John 6 through 8 as preparatory. And Revelation 7 and 14 specifically. That's your test, all right? But in the Feast of Sukkot was the Feast of Ingathering. The Greek term was hiortis synagoge. What is Jesus predicting in Matthew 24:31? The great ingathering. This is a direct reference. It is a direct allusion to the Feast of Sukkot. By the way, when would it take place? Sounding of the great trumpet. That comes from Isaiah chapter 27, verse 13. At the sounding of the great trumpet, all of those who are ready to perish and about ready to die, who are scattered abroad, this is the diaspora, this is the regathering of Israel. They would come to Jerusalem and worship the Lord their God. This is the resurrection. This is where Jesus is drawing from in Matthew 27, 13. And in verse 34, he said it was going to be in that generation. Does everyone see the connection? The great feast of ingathering, the Hiortes Synagogue, is the time of the Episynagogue of Matthew chapter 24 and verse 31. Finally, Matthew 24 and verse 36. As Jesus discussed that time, that judgment, I'm well aware of the fact and the argument that everyone says, oh, well, in Matthew 24, 36, Jesus was changing subjects. From the time of the fall, from the discussion of the fall of Jerusalem to the end of time. No, that ignores the covenantal and the festal references. But of that day and hour knows no man. Well, okay. You're just going to let that keep going, aren't you? If you allow me just a moment. When Paul referred to the new moons, he was referring specifically to the feast of Rosh Hashanah, the feast of the trumpets, the feast that represented judgment. And the reason I say that this is so important is because in Jewish concept, in the rabbinic writings, Rosh Hashanah was not only the time, the sounding of the trumpet, it was the time of the judgment. The period of time, the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur was the time of awe and repentance and prayer. And at that time, God had 3 books that He would open. Oh, the opening of the books? That sound familiar to anyone? But here's the really, really strange thing about the Feast of the New Moons, Rosh Hashanah. It had to occur at a very specific time. And if cloud cover covered the moon to where you couldn't see the new moon, and you know the new moon is just the very, very first tiny little sliver that you can see. If fog or clouds or whatever kept you from seeing that, they didn't know when to start the festival. So the Jewish high priest would send witnesses to different mountaintops, at least 3 mountaintops, and at least 3 witnesses on top of each mountain. And it was the responsibility of the witnesses, the moment they saw a clear vision of the new moon, run back to the high priest and say, the new moon, the new moon, the new moon has come. And they would declare Rosh Hashanah had begun. But as a direct result of the uncertainty of being able to witness the appearance of the new moon, Rosh Hashanah was the feast. It was the only feast of which it was said, of that day and hour knows no man. Do you see what Jesus is doing in His temple and Olivet Discourse? Jesus, a thoroughgoing Jew, in speaking of the impending judgment, and I haven't even got to Zechariah 14 to tie all this in, but Jesus, a thoroughgoing Jew, in his discussion of the impending judgment of Jerusalem, draws directly from the vernacular, the well-known euphemisms even, of the feast days to let them know. It kind of goes back to his statement, let him who hears or has ears, let him hear. If you're wise, if you understand, you'll be able to escape. 3 direct references to the feast days from Matthew 23:39 through Matthew 24, verse 36. In the lesson tomorrow, I hope to be able to share with you some of my excitement, enthusiasm over the incredible power of the narrative of Jesus in John and in Revelation as it relates to the fulfillment of Sukkot, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of the Resurrection. I don't even get to discuss atonement, okay? And I'm sorry for that, but I want to spend my time sharing with you what to me is some of the most exciting information I have ever discovered in my studies. Thank you very much. I personally think you cut my time.
Good job. It's hard for us to imagine just how important those feast days are. And if we could grasp them and really make them common in our discussion of eschatology. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you. Okay. So as I was saying, if we could make them common, the feast days common in our study of eschatology, it would just easily and quickly dismiss all this attempted division of Matthew 24. And once you got rid of that, game over. I mean, it's game over at that point. I don't know whether Dunn's going to cover it, but, you know, as he talked about the Feast of Trumpets, when you look at Matthew 24 and you get to Matthew 25, every parable that Jesus uses in Matthew 25 is nothing but an expression of one of the concepts of the Feast of Trumpets. And that's what makes it so simple. So it's something that we should really understand. We appreciate that lesson from Dunn, and at this time.